Good evening. Welcome to another episode of Commander's GridIron. I'm your host, Steve Lockman, and tonight we have a packed show of information and tidbits about all things Washington Commanders related. There's no shortage of news, drama, etc. in the DC area, and of course, our team is not immune to that at all. So, as we start off tonight, we're going to start off with a couple little random potpourri things, but something that kind of jumped out as we alluded to earlier when we started the show about a month ago. There's always stadium news. And one of the things that was kind of interesting this week that came out in the DC market was that a gentleman by the name of Thad Shealy was hired by the Washington Commanders. Now, a lot of people don't or will not recognize that name, Thad Shealy, at all, but he's pretty prominent in the professional sports market, especially dealing with real estate and finance. So where that kind of makes it interesting and makes the conversation kind of take a turn for new stadium is that Thad Shealy was prominent with two bigger markets for professional sports. One being in the Atlanta market. He was actually the COO, the chief operations officer, if I can spit that out, for the Atlanta Hawks, and getting there a new arena deal that was downtown Atlanta done a couple years ago. And then Mr. Shealy also has experience as the senior vice president of finance for the New York Jets. Where that comes into play was Shealy was very instrumental in finalizing the deal between the Jets, the Giants, and New Jersey to get what is now MetLife Stadium done. So where that comes in of note was, I think a lot of people, fans, media, etc., thought that even though the new owners coming into DC were going to take some time to evaluate what the previous regime had already done for possible stadium procurement, so to speak, it kind of seems like this process is gaining some momentum. This process is gaining some steam, getting some feet on the ground, and you're going to see things come out every so often, such as this, that will make fans excited, will get fans engaged, get the media talking about the process, correct, right? So it seems like it's not a big deal, but when you take that Mitchell Rales, one of the managing partners of the Commanders under Josh Harris, who's leading the stadium charge since the current lease at FedEx Field runs out in 2027. This is kind of big news that we're bringing somebody on board who has that experience, who's done it before, who's tackled big projects in the professional sports markets. One of the things to note is, that he's worked in a lot of markets, but these two in particular are probably two of the 5 biggest markets in the country when we talk about Atlanta as well as the New York market itself. No matter what the sport is, whether it's football, baseball, hockey, basketball, New York and Atlanta are always at the top of the list for markets. So what does that mean? Not only from a financial perspective, as far as figuring out who's paying for what, cost of the stadium, cost overruns, all that stuff, etc., but also more of a political side of things, right? How to deal with the local politicians and getting the stadium deal done that you need when it comes to dollars and cents, because it's all about how much public money is going to be put into a stadium deal versus private money. This gentleman brings that astute experience to the table that will help this ownership group figure out what the best option is, how to put that best package together, and move things forward, knowing that the lease ends in 4 years, and then we're going to be um, putting together that package for the stadium and anything like that. As Paul says, who might the major bidder of the stadium be yet? Naming rights. I can honestly say two things. A, I don't know who the stadium naming rights might be. There was a mention and a push recently. I don't even think Paul saw it since he's up in the Philly market and a Dallas fan. But there's a fan push that even though we do naming rights to a stadium, whatever it may be, FedEx, Pepsi, a bank, whoever the big sponsor wants to be for the DC market. But if we go back to the RFK complex, which was once the hallowed ground of the Washington Redskins and this franchise for so many years, was that the name of the stadium would be the sponsor ABC at RFK. When I kind of thought about that, knowing that RFK is at the top of the list for me as far as locations to go back to, and I thought about how they put that name together for the stadium, kind of thought that was a pretty awesome deal, right? Pretty awesome idea. Not only do you bring back the RFK part for all the old fans who kind of disowned the team going through the Snyder era and the rebranding and everything else, which is yet to be seen as we go through this season into the next season, but it also brings back that history of where you were. Obviously, if that stadium gets built at RFK and they tear RFK down, there's a direct correlation there. So you're not necessarily fully naming the new stadium RFK, basically an RFK 2.0, but we're going to have the principal sponsor of the field and at RFK linked together for the new stadium. I think it's an awesome idea. As far as sponsors, one thing that I could probably say with certainty, even though it's nowhere written, this is basically just a complete guess, is that FedEx Field, or FedEx, I should say, will not be the parent company once the lease runs out at FedEx Field after 2027. I think they've been a great sponsor over the years. They've obviously given the team a decent amount of money to kind of keep up with renovations and some new ideas, even though it's one of the worst stadiums in the NFL. But they did their purpose, right? It was a 10-year deal. I think 150 million, something like that. It was one of the first big naming rights deals for NFL stadiums in NFL history back when it was signed. But one of the things that going forward, the relationship that they had with the team when Dan Snyder ended his regime, as well as taking the heat for possibly being the ones that were a big proponent of the name change, et cetera, et cetera. I just don't see FedEx dumping themselves back in as a huge stadium sponsor. They'll definitely be a sponsor somehow within the stadium, kind of like FanDuel is, Pepsi, and some of the other ones. I just don't see the stadium being named after them. But as a lot of us dedicated fans know, and Paul alluded to a couple seconds ago, RFK is that hallowed ground. So to somehow tie that name into the discussion or the title of what would be the new stadium, like some of the other teams do with a parent sponsor, and then tied into an owner's name or a previous owner's name or the city or wherever they are, would be a pretty cool idea. So as I was talking to Paul earlier, one of the things that unfortunately makes news in DC, whether you want to or don't want to, is past players and their actions, right? Only because this individual is tied to the team does it make news. It's DC. Everything makes the news when you're tied to the Commanders. And unfortunately, Fred Smoot was just one of those individuals who can't get away from the headlines or the media. Why does this make news? It's not really a news story, right? Apparently, an arrest warrant was issued for Fred Smoot. Fred Smoot turned himself in to get arrested last week. That, one of the things that the arrest warrant said, there's like 2 or 3 charges, but I think one of the biggest things was outstanding child support, right? To most people, it's like, hey, look, there's child support. He's probably owes a couple years and $100,000 on child support. I didn't look up the details, but he, obviously got arrested for it, turned himself in. He's still in jail, trying to figure things out. Why is it a news story? It's a news story because Fred Smoot does the pregame, postgame shows for the Washington Commanders on their flagship radio stations, as well as sometimes on the local TV market. So not having Fred Smoot around for training camp, especially during the fact that we just had the first preseason game when he was supposed to be on the air, people are kind of like, hey, where's Fred Smoot? Well, there's a reason why Fred Smoot isn't on the air. Fred Smoot's watching the pregame, postgame show from jail in Loudoun County, Virginia. So it kind of makes sense. Okay, this is why it's a news story, because Fred had a job to do with the team and wasn't there to fulfill those duties. So I just saw Eileen asked, where do I think the stadium might be built? As we just talked about with the new stadium, I agree. I think they would build the stadium kind of in the same area. Real quick to reiterate, kind of talk about the options real quick before we move on. Stadium options right now is basically to stay at FedEx Field and take that property and redo it. That's number one. Number two is RFK. That puts them back in the District of Columbia in DC and ties Washington Commanders, kind of like the Washington Redskins were for so many years, back to Washington, DC proper. There's still a land parcel agreement, hasn't been fully executed and purchased yet, south of the district along I-95 in Woodbridge area, down 95. It's like 45 minutes to an hour south of DC. Other than being along 95, that's like the only good point about being down there. And then there's also an option that there's talk about having to move out towards Loudoun County. The only problem with Loudoun County is that place is getting so developed right now that I don't know if they have enough land and infrastructure to support the stadium out in Virginia. So my choice would be one, take it back to RFK. It's where they were. It's already there. Legislation is already moving through the state, the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate to make some zoning changes to facilitate that change to them. Option number two would be to go stay in FedEx. The only problem with FedEx is there's not really any mass transit options for FedEx area. It's basically you drive in off 495 for those of you that have or have not been there before. A lot of parking, a lot of tailgating, and it's a traffic nightmare getting back out. But going down to Virginia isn't really a good option either. It's just more of FedEx, but worse, so to speak. One of the things that the Commanders did do real quick is they picked up a tight end. We'll talk about the preseason game coming up in a little bit in the second half of the show. But it kind of as a result of the first preseason game, the Commanders went out and signed tight end Caden Smith. Pretty sure he was a former Giant. I know we got guys that do the big blue power hour on out of the box sports entertainment, if I can spit that out. That, so I don't think he spent a lot of time there. Don't know how productive he was. There's issues with Logan Thomas being tight end number one. We saw some issues with the other tight ends, Bates and Turner, that we're going to get into later. So this signing kind of does raise some eyebrows, makes you go, huh? And can be something to keep an eye on as we go through the rest of training camp. One of the things that also came out from this past week's first preseason game was owner Josh Harris. This guy is everywhere that you can think of. Training camp every other day, if not every day. At the preseason game, bright and early in the afternoon. Subsequently got rain delayed for like an hour and 15 minutes or something like that. Lo and behold, what starts popping up on Twitter, what starts popping up on Facebook and everything else? There's a photo of Josh Harris and his son sitting in the stands watching the game. The first thing everybody started questioning was, is that really Josh Harris? And the more time went on, people were like, yep, that's him. That's his son sitting there. They're in the first row behind the team at the 50-yard line. They're like, why isn't this dude in a suite? He should be watching the game dry, in the air conditioning. It's, why is he out there? Why is he doing this? So, of course, nobody wants to ask him that during the game. They wait till afterwards. And one of the local DC insiders, JP Finley from 106.7 The Fan, asked Josh Harris exactly why were you sitting out in the rain watching your team play basically a meaningless preseason game. And Josh Harris had this to say, quote, "It's not my team. It's the city's team. being out here and being part of the team that I cheer for and that I grew up with is incredible. At the same time, I can feel the pressure. It's the beginning of a long season and we got to get it done. So I'm out here to support my guys. So, as Paul just says, hey, an owner sitting amongst the fans, that's unheard of. You know, would you see Jerry Jones doing that? Probably not. And I'm going to tell you right now, in the 24 years that Dan Snyder's been owner, Dan Snyder has never sat in the stands outside of the owner's box that I'm aware of. As even from the last 5 years being a season ticket holder, never seen pictures, never seen mention of it. He may go down on the field pre-game, post-game, halftime special, stuff like that. But Snyder would never sit in the common fan area outside of the owner's suite. So this is something that's pretty cool. Is this something that's going to continue from Josh Harris? Is this something that, as I kind of reach out to the other sports fans in the areas from Philadelphia, New Jersey with the Devils and 76ers and things, excuse me, is this something that Harris has done there before? I don't know the answer to that, but as we move on in the tenure of Josh Harris as the majority owner, he's doing and saying everything that he needs to be the fresh new owner, the man of the people. He's brought so many changes to training camp already. He's brought just an attitude, an aura of excitement, a change of culture already in the months that this guy and his partners have owned the Washington Commanders. So with that, it kind of became natural then at the end of the game. I was watching Coach Rivera in the locker room at Cleveland, and they were doing game ball presentations. And Coach Rivera went to the equipment manager and asked for the first game ball, and the first game ball by Coach Rivera went to Josh Harris. And one of the things that Coach Rivera said was, we're excited to have you on board. We're excited for this upcoming season. We're excited of all the changes. And you can see that what Josh Harris is bringing is already rubbing off into the locker room, not only to the players, but it's also to the coaches, the executive staff, to Jason Wright, the president, the GM, et cetera, all the way down to, the janitors cleaning the stadium. So it's interesting that, they recognize that on the first big occasion to give him his first game ball as owner of the Washington Commanders. So it's great to see, as Paul says, being in the Philly market, that Josh shows up to Sixers games, seems to incorporate the fans. So it seems like this is not new to just DC. That, it's not something that he's saying just to say because he's the new owner. He's not just trying to sell tickets or suites. It's him being genuine. It's how he runs his team. I got to laugh when Joe says, hey, let's tell Josh Harris to fix the Sixers. It's funny because one of the things we talked about last week, we can touch on it now, was, what kind of owner was Josh Harris? That when I looked back since he became principal owner or managing principal owner with the Blitzer Harris group, the New Jersey Devils haven't won a championship in New Jersey. They haven't, up until this past season, been overly good to the conference finals or a deep playoff run in hockey. The Sixers kind of the same way, right? Good, not great, not championship caliber. So what can we really expect, with Josh Harris and his group here in DC with the Commanders? Are we going to win a Super Bowl this year? Probably not. Next year, maybe. Who knows? It's a long-term process, right? But we're putting the pieces in place. So it's interesting that, Joe says about fixing the Sixers, that I saw a thing DC related, but they were busting on Ted Leonsis, who owns the Capitals, and the fact that he owns the Washington Wizards as well, multi-sport owner here in DC. And they're like, hey, while the Capitals pretty good, winning the Stanley Cup 5 years ago, 2018, couple playoff runs, deep playoff runs as well. And the Sixers the Wizards are annually at the bottom of the Eastern Conference for the NBA. Is that something that we should be worried about with Josh Harris? That was kind of the point of the article that I read. with having an owner that's a multi-sport owner and comparing teams, even though they're not directly apples to apples, but looking at that perspective of how teams do when they're under multiple owners. So it definitely will be interesting, but it's great to see Josh Harris being that man of the people so far early in the season. Hopefully, it translates all the way through the season, and it can only result in great things happening. So, but as we know, there's always headlines, always things going on in DC, and one of the things that came out kind of started last week, maybe even a couple of days before last week's show, was the fact that Ron Rivera was asked about practice during training camp in Ashburn. And one of the things that he was asked about was the intensity levels and the conditioning and how the guys are responding to that. And the fact that with this year, a lot of the practices, especially other than like special teams and the schedule of things, were being handled by the new offensive coordinator, Eric Bienemny, who just came from Kansas City. The guy is a two-time Super Bowl champ with Kansas City, has that Super Bowl intensity, that repertoire, knows how to get things done, right? So when Ron Rivera answers that question, says, hey, look, here's the deal. In no specific words, I've had a couple players come to me, question EB's intensity in training camp and how hard he goes, how intense it is, how much conditioning there is. The list goes on and on, right? And Ron Rivera said, look, here's what I did. I told those guys, first off, EB's running the practice. Until we go strictly defensive or special teams, and even 11 on 11, 7 on 7s, it's EB's show, right? So if you have a problem with the conditioning, the intensity, the accountability, the new attitude, the new culture that's going into practice, go talk to EB. This is what Ron Rivera put out in his morning press conference after practice one day. Typically, that's where it would end, okay? Coach Rivera says, hey, look, you got an issue, go take it up with the coach. The offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator, Jack Del Rio, defensive coaches, your specialty coaches, your position coaches, go talk to those people. If that doesn't resolve, come back to me. DC media takes this and runs with it, that EB is too hard, too difficult, too intense in training camp, according to a bunch of players. Now, obviously, the players aren't being named, okay? So that's number one. Number two, yes, Coach Ron Rivera put it out in his presser, but is it really that big of a deal? Probably not. I saw a lot of fans on social media this week saying, hey, look, that's something that needs to be dealt with in-house in the locker room. Should have never came out by Coach Rivera. Why did he do that? So my take on it is twofold. One, I don't mind that Coach Rivera threw that out there. He was asked a question by one of the local media guys at the press conference, giving an honest answer, didn't pull the old Bill Belichick or, one of the other coaches that says no comment or beats around the bush or gives a completely obscure response to the reporter. It actually throws out a legitimate answer, and without specifically naming players or throwing them under the bus, makes it a point that, hey, look, practices and training camp is a lot more intense this year than last year and even the year before. So is there any correlation to the way we're preparing or performing, or hopefully will be performing in 2023 to the previous season? Well, that leaves it up to debate for all the diehard fans, keyboard warriors, and sports media people in the DC market to contend with, right? So where that comes in then is because it's making news in DC and it's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, it's on the radio, it's on TV, it's everywhere you look. It now becomes a national issue, so that it's hitting ESPN, Fox Sports, CBS Sports. First Stephen A is debating it on First Take, and Colin Cowherd and everybody else, to the point that Ron Rivera feels pressured by somebody, whether I don't think it was necessarily from Josh Harris or maybe the GM or maybe just being hounded in general, that he comes back out a couple days later and says, hey, I put my foot in my mouth. I'm basically in not so many words, retracting my statement of, bashing EB, even though he wasn't, um, for his intensity during training camp. So Ron Rivera is kind of giving what appears to be a half-assed apology only because he has to, not because he wants to. So there's no sincerity behind it, and kind of leaves it at that, right? But it's kind of interesting that a lot of people then become engrossed in the EB intensity discussion. So whether it's former Redskins players, and we'll use that because that's when they played, guys were like, look, these guys today are soft. These guys, Doc Walker, former Super Bowl champion tight end during the Hog era, was like, hey, look, we need to find out who, I think his quote was, we need to find out who these pussies are, who these guys are that are soft, and they're getting cut tomorrow. So it's a lot of common reactions like that will get, this discussion keeps the discussion going. So to the point that, if the former players are like, hey, look, when you lose so many times, so many seasons in a row, like that's what here you have a guy who I said earlier was a 2-time Super Bowl champ. And as Paul said, the Chiefs equals rings. EB is a 2-time Super Bowl champion coach. He knows what it takes to get the team from the preseason through the regular season, through deep into the playoffs, and produce a multi-time Super Bowl champion. EB even said during his press conferences during this whole debacle that, hey, look, I'm going to practice my guys hard. We're going to over practice our guys so it becomes second nature. If they don't get a play right, if they mess up an alignment, formation, motion, whatever, they're running the play again. Not, 2 plays later, 3 plays later, like the very next play was, hey, we're running a counter to the right. We're running a trap to the left. We're running this passing route combination or whatever, that we're doing it again. That's the accountability part. So as Paul said, we train at the 150% so that when you go out to play the regular games, that 100% feels like it's a piece of cake, right? To the point that even a couple of days ago, somebody in the Chiefs camp, Kansas City Chiefs camp, asked Andy Reid, hey, man, like, what is your take on the whole EB intensity during training camp? Is that something you approve of? What's your response? Was he too hard in Kansas City? And Andy Reid, to his credit, put out a quote that says, EB's a tough kid, but he gets the guys right. There's nothing wrong with that. That's his personality, and guys play for him. He's had great success as a running back coach and now an offensive coordinator. When it's all said and done, his guys will appreciate it when they are winning games. And Andy Reid hits it on the head at the very end, right? When EB's intensity and training regimen and accountability now starts equating to wins throughout the season and begins that long-term culture change and consistency, you're going to start seeing guys buying in. You're going to start seeing team buy-in, right? That ultimately with that culture change, hey, we can win. We can do this. Practice isn't that hard. We're not doing the old Allen Iverson practice. What's practice? We ain't got time for practice. It's something that can only benefit the Commanders moving forward, having EB as that offensive coordinator and, setting the stage for what's going to be the season. So, as Paul says, he's absolutely right that the Chiefs have avoided conditioning injuries because they are in shape for the regular season. So, the Chiefs don't have very many people get injured in week 1 or the first couple of weeks, pulling that hamstring, pulling that, there's muscles in the legs, having torn muscles in the chest, whatever, conditioning issues. And it's kind of one of the things that's always been, no pun intended, an Achilles heel for the Washington Commanders is injuries in training camp. We always lose one person or two in training camp to severe injuries, ACLs, Achilles, torn pecs or triceps, something like that, torn biceps, other injuries like that, we're kind of already mediocre to just above average at best. And then now you gotta either go find somebody for depth or go find somebody completely replace that person that just got hurt. So I agree that, with EB's training strategy, hopefully it prevents those injuries going into week one and kind of even going further than that. So it kind of remains to be seen. I don't see the intensity changing at all for EB. Um, One of the things that, as players were doing interviews throughout the week, we noticed that there wasn't really nobody's going to throw anybody else under the bus, right? But if we were to take a guess, we're going to start on the offensive side, right? So it kind of goes back to, okay, who do we think is complaining to Rivera that, hey, man, the coach is too hard on me? I don't like the conditioning drills. Intensity is too hard. We're running too many plays. It's kind of interesting that one of the stats now that, analytics are becoming a little bit more of a part of the team, especially now that Harris is owner, was some crazy statistic I read last week that this year's training camp compared to 2022 and 2021, there's like 100 to 130% more plays being run or practiced in training camp this year under EB than previous years. So it kind of sounds like a useless stat, but it's actually kind of important, right? The fact that the team, offense, defense, special teams, whatever, 7-on-7s, position groups or whatever, are getting more work in to learn the playbook, become more familiar with each other, become more familiar with the formations, the motions, and everything else, as well as execution, that, you know, they are able to process so much more information and so many more plays in training camp than they ever were in the previous years. So it kind of makes you wonder, like, what was Scott Turner doing the last 3 seasons? Why was there no sense of urgency? Why was there no real accountability? Because it seems like all these new things that is coming in with EB is now changing the team for the better. So we can only hope that that kind of translates into early season success. And as we see in a little bit, our first 4, 6, even first half of the season is no cakewalk by any stretch of the imagination, even though we finished last in the division last year. But, we'll see what happens as we go through camp and as the team gets prepared to make that week one opening. Because one of the things that we've always struggled with is a very slow start. Traditionally, we've gone 1-3, 2-2, usually not really better than 500 over the first 4 weeks. So as Paul says, it makes sense, right? That aggressive speed of camp equals more reps, more mental memory. You get more plays under your belt. And yes, they've run plays 3, 4 times to get it right with EB at the helm. So something to keep an eye on as we go through the next 2 weeks of preseason training camp. Speaking of preseason, we had our first preseason game last week. Started out with a little over an hour rain delay. Well, actually, not really a rain delay, but a lightning delay. A lot of fans on social media are like, hey, man, like, this would never happen in DC. Actually, it would. One of the things that the NFL does not take lightly is weather. And not necessarily weather in general. They play in the snow, they play in the rain. It could be a monsoon, it could be a blizzard, and you can't even see the field they're going to play. One of the things that they take very seriously in terms of weather is lightning. I'm not sure what the mile radius is outside of a stadium that the NFL calls the game, but there was some in Cleveland. So that, hey, everybody's got to go off the field, emptied the stadium of the fans. Not sure where all the fans went, but it was a little over an hour until game really started. So one of the things that was talked about on the pregame show up until kickoff of the preseason game was, because of this delay, would you see the starters playing in the game from either team, especially DC? And I kind of thought about it that, hey, look, I could see why they would not play the starters at the beginning of the preseason game. But let's take it realistically, right? As we go through each preseason game, which as we go longer, each one becomes basically meaningless, really. It's more for position players, who's making the cut at the end of the season, and depth, practice squad issues, whatever. the starters need to play. They always play the most they're going to play in preseason during game one. So we're not going to sit them out game one, bring them in Monday night against Baltimore after you just played Baltimore in two inter-team practices, which we're going to talk about here in the second half of the show. But, you know, we also need, for number two, we need Sam Howell to get those reps. We need Sam Howell to get more comfortable with the offense. We need Sam Howell to get more comfortable with the offensive line, which had its issues in this game that night. We also need Sam Howell to get comfortable with the wide receivers, which in the short two drives that he played looked pretty decent, right? So at the end of the game, I don't put much stock in the score. It's preseason. Whatever. DC ended up winning 17-15. Okay, we won a preseason game. No big deal. My take on the game is, how did the guys do at specific positions, specific groups that were either predicted to do decent things? How did the line gel, since we had a bunch of new guys either brought in, guys moving positions, et cetera, et cetera? How did that look? So first, let's start with Sam Howell. Sam Howell did two drives, finished the night at, actually, I guess 3 drives, finished the night at 9 out of 12, 77 yards for 1 touchdown, 119 quarterback rating, and 8 rushing yards. Not bad for a couple little drives. Probably one of the biggest things was with him, was able to get the ball out, did a decent job reading defenses, had a couple times where he was hurried, offensive line issues that we'll talk about in a second, but overall didn't do too bad. He put together some throws when he needed to. He didn't do bad. He did what he needed to do. He almost reminded me of the game manager type when Alex Smith was quarterback for the Washington football team 2 to 3 years ago, where he didn't really put up stellar numbers, but he didn't turn the ball over. He had good reads, had good progressions, dumped it down when he needed to, scrambled when he could, and he saw the opportunity to scramble, and kind of made the most of his opportunities, right? But one of the things that was kind of interesting about the preseason night in Sam Howell was his lone touchdown. His lone touchdown was to second-year player Jahan Dotson, wide receiver standout, graduate from Penn State University, that basically burned the pants off of a safety for the long catch into the end zone. And it was so interesting but comical at the same time. Somebody asked, I don't remember the reporter, asked Jahan Dotson, said, "Hey, why were you so open? How did you get open? How did you make the catch going into the end zone?" Jahan Dotson's direct quote was, "As soon as I saw Cleveland line up a safety over top of me on that particular play, I knew it wasn't going to be good for the safety," end quote. And it showed with that passing play. So Jahan Dotson, even though he's a second-year guy, is going to be our number 2 wide receiver behind Terry McLaurin, who's pretty awesome in himself. That dude could be an annual Pro Bowler every single year and throw up awesome numbers if only he had a consistently good quarterback. Unfortunately, that's not the case in DC. So we bring in Jahan Dotson, that, is smaller in stature. The guy is only like 5'9", maybe 5'10" at best. Speedy little demon. Kind of reminds me of little Speedy Gonzalez out on the football field. But he is one of the purest route runners in the NFL, especially for number 2 wide receivers, that you're going to find in the league. And it shows. Cuts are perfect. Routes are great. Has a great response to creating separation among DBs and safeties, which is one reason why he was able to make that connection last year between Taylor Heineke, between Carson Wentz, between whoever else they threw in a quarterback, outside of the 4 weeks that he was hurt last year. So I expect another big season out of Jahan Dotson. And if that chemistry with Sam Howell and even with Terry McLaurin keeps progressing, you're going to see a pretty dangerous combo that we're going to need as we go forward. So some of the other things that kind of came out with the preseason game against the Cleveland Browns was offensive line. So we had a couple penalties. Okay, you kind of always have penalties at the offensive line that, false start, holding. One of the biggest ones was the holding in the end zone. I think they were on like their own 3 to 4. They were within the 5 yard line. Um, Gates had a holding penalty in the end zone, which, unbeknownst to me, who doesn't know, 1001 rules of NFL football, is an automatic safety. So it kind of became a little discussion point in our group texting that we do it out of the box sports about, hey, when did that become safety? Blah 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 blah. But it's something that, as bad as it happens in preseason, I'd rather have that happen in preseason than week 1 against Arizona Cardinals, right? It shouldn't happen at all, point blank. But if it's going to happen, let it happen in the preseason game. Let it become a learning experience. Let it become the last mistake like that you're going to make, so that we learn from it. We know why it happened. We know the consequences of said action. Hey, look, man, we just gave up 2 points and we got to give the ball back. That we can't have it happen again. So one of the things that we noticed was the offensive line wasn't quite gelling. It's as Paul alludes to, it's that short-term memory, right? That's what preseason's for. You make your mistake, you learn from them, you watch the film. Ron Rivera in his press conferences is always about, hey, look, we're going to watch the film. We're going to figure out what we did wrong. We're going to figure out what we did right. We're going to fix the things that we did wrong. And hopefully we don't have those happen again in the next preseason game, or more importantly, in week 1, as we get into the beginning of the regular season. So I think some of the positives for the offensive line was moving Cosme over to guard. Definitely more of a fit for him, being natural there. It kind of seemed like it. Did fairly well. The offensive line didn't do too bad. Cleveland had already played a preseason game, in the Hall of Fame game the week before against the New York Jets. So their mindset and perspective going into this game is going to be a little bit different than the Commanders going into their first preseason game, right? So that they may be trying a couple of things differently. They kind of already know what may or may not work. So they're not going to do too many things against Washington's O-line that, hey, we already know this, or too many looks. It's going to be a lot of vanilla, right? So that we're going to throw some things at them, might throw a couple more blitzes at them, might expand the defensive playbook a little bit, but not a whole lot. So, but overall, all in all, the offensive line didn't do too bad. One of the things, kind of as the offensive unit, that looked a little suspect was our tight end group. So we kind of knew this going into the preseason this year, that tight end, we probably either should have signed a really good free agent tight end or drafted a good tight end, because this draft class this year was heavy on good tight ends. So we could have picked one up. But we were like, oh, no, we don't need that. We're not going to waste draft picks on that. We're gonna go with what we got. So Logan Thomas has been predominantly hurt during the season, that he didn't even play. And I think that I don't even know if he's going to be ready for week 1. He didn't make the trip to Baltimore today to do practice. He didn't practice yesterday. Didn't practice the day before. He's done individual drills on the sideline, so he may or may not be ready by week 1. So it gives Cole Turner and Bates a chance, an opportunity to present themselves on the stage during that preseason game. So we kind of knew that Bates was the better blocker, better run blocker, better pass blocker, with a little bit of release, a little bit worse on receiving. Vice versa, that Turner was better on the receiving side, but worse on the blocking side. And those two things kind of came to fruition, right? So on the first drive, I think it was second or third down, might have been third, that Sam Howell had Bates wide open down the field, 20, 25 yards, something like that. And it literally donked right off his hands, might even have hit his helmet and went incomplete. Perfectly easy catch. Nobody within 3 to 5 yards of him. Should have caught it. Maybe even had a little yak afterwards. And obviously the easy first down. Didn't make the play. And I think it might even have got called back on holding on top of it or something like that. So it made it even worse. Then we go to the next drive. Turner comes in. Turner struggles a little bit with blocking. The defensive front of Cleveland, of which Myles Garrett wasn't even playing, so they didn't even really have their top guys in at that play. But Turner turns around throughout the game, not just from Howe, but even from Brissett later on, and makes two pretty good to really good catches downfield, from one from Howe, one from Brissett. So, we know that, hey, look, Turner is that receiving tight end. We just have to figure out how to make him a better blocker. Conversely, we got to look at Bates and be like, hey, look, Bates is a really good blocker, but we got to give him the hands of Turner. So if we could take both of those guys and kind of turn them into one, we'd be phenomenal. The problem that we're going to run into, as I alluded to on last week's show, that EB likes to run a lot of multi-tight end formations. Sometimes that's a lot of two tight end formations, and sometimes even 3 tight end formations on the rarity, but at least that double. Kind of goes back to formations that we used to run when the Hogs were prevalent in the late 80s, early 90s, especially in 91 season when we won the Super Bowl. They used a lot of 2 tight end sets. That's kind of one of the predominant features of Joe Gibbs' offense when he was coaching in DC. So it's just something to watch out for. On the defensive side of the Cleveland ball, a couple things stood out. First off, Emmanuel Forbes, first-round draft pick out of Mississippi State, is the real deal. Kid's a ball hawk, little thin, framey guy, not afraid to hit, not afraid to come up, make the tackle, put his head into it when he needs to, tries to break up the passes, good coverage, good man-to-man, kind of good with the situational awareness. Kid won't be a problem. So I think he'll do fine. And one of the things we'll talk about here in a little bit is what happened in training camp today and the inter-team practices with Baltimore. So the kid's only getting better. Second, the front four. Front four didn't play a whole lot together, all 4 of them at the same time, meaning Montez Sweat, Allen, Payne, and Chase Young. But when they did, they were iffy to at best. What I mean by that was, unfortunately, they had a lot of outside containment issues, predominantly Montez Sweat and Chase Young, because they played the edges. But also, we gave up some decent yards running, especially from the mobile quarterback on the inside from Allen and Payne. When they were playing together, that kind of worries me. So this group kind of always starts off slow. Chase Young only played 1, maybe 2 series before he got a stinger, ended up coming out. They were cycling guys in between Mathis and, some of the other guys. Montez Sweat was balling around, had a big play on the defensive line for a goal line stand with Payne and some of the other cats as well. So I think they'll be fine in the long run, as long as as long as Young and Sweat can maintain that outside containment, not get upfield too far, and then end up flushing the quarterback into the pocket and then even out of the pocket to scramble, right? Because one of the things that we noticed was Deshaun Watson is almost in Houston Texan form, right? I mean, he didn't play a whole lot last year at all, especially the year before. So this is kind of his first season to put a whole season together, especially in Cleveland. But one of the things that I looked at is, it kind of goes deeper than the front four. So then we're typically predominantly only playing a 2 linebacker system in preseason, but we don't have the linebackers to match up with a mobile quarterback. I love Jamin Davis. He's a great kid, but he's still not the linebacker we need, even in the outside linebacker position. For that position, he's still a project piece. He's maybe a backup at best, but he's getting there, and you're seeing that progression, which is what we want to see. But he's going to get the start. He's going to be the starting outside linebacker. Cody Barton, who we brought in from Seattle, is a seasoned vet, but he's also a seasoned vet who's a little bit older, who's taking the hits, who needs to be a little bit more mobile in the middle to account for that mobile quarterback. So if you saw the game and watched it, Deshaun Watson would do all of his reads, see that his check down to the left or the right isn't any good, he'd take off and start running. The problem is we didn't have anybody to account for it, which then kind of makes me worried, right? That, okay, it's only preseason. It's Deshaun Watson. He's a mobile quarterback. That guy's going to get some yards. He's going to get some rushes. But how do we defend that? How do we account for that? Going into the season, how are we going to account for that, right? So luckily, week 1, we got the Arizona Cardinals. Traditionally, if he wouldn't be hurt, it would be Kyler Murray, pretty mobile quarterback. Although I feel fairly confident that Kyler Murray is not going to play in week 1. Okay, so we might not have a mobile quarterback to face in week 1. Week 2, it's Denver Broncos, Russell Wilson. Is Russell Wilson going to be the Russell Wilson of 2022? Or is Russell Wilson going to be the quarterback that we've known him to be from the Seattle Seahawks days, where he was running, he was gunning, he was slinging, he was juking and jiving? Is he going to be the old Russell Wilson, or is it going to be more of a in the pocket only, not quite as mobile Russell Wilson, but the potential is there for another mobile quarterback? Week 3 is Buffalo Bills. We all know Jared Allen, right? Jared Allen's probably one of the top 5, top 10 best quarterbacks in the league right now. So, but one of the things that Jared Allen does is Josh Allen is not afraid to use his feet. So, he's right up there with his running backs for leading the league, for leading his team and rushing every week. Pretty mobile quarterback. Week 4, as we know, there's some Philly fans in here. We got Philadelphia Eagles and Jalen Hurts. Kind of explains itself, right? The dude's mobile, can make plays with his feet, took his team all the way to the Super Bowl last year. Enough said, right? Week 5, Chicago Bears. We now have C.J. Stroud, or Justin Fields for the Chicago Bears. The kid's prolific. He's only getting better. Last year, he tried to do it all with his feet because his receivers were shitty and his offensive line was too. So another mobile quarterback. Last but not least, rounding out the first half of the season, we had the Atlanta Falcons, New York Giants, and then the Eagles once again. So we're going to see that Jalen Hurts again twice within the first half of the season. New York Giants, Danny Dimes. He burned us last year rushing with his feet, being mobile. We couldn't account for that. We're going to be able to do it this year. And the Atlanta Falcons, kind of a suspect team, right? It's going to be Desmond Ridder still by week 6, maybe, hopefully. Or is it going to be Taylor Heineke, the backup that he just signed for a couple $1 million a year to be Ridder's backup? So our defense will definitely can be suspect and susceptible to the mobile quarterback. And that's kind of my fear. So one of the things that's going to be interesting to see as we go into the week number 2 preseason game, we play the Ravens Monday night. I don't think we're going to see a lot, if any, of Lamar Jackson, maybe for a drive, maybe 2, if he even plays at all. But that's a very mobile quarterback. One I would like to see our defensive guys play against, right? We need that experience. We need that exposure to get that big learning curve. One of the things, and I don't think we're going to see him play in the 3rd and final preseason game, but we play Cincinnati the following Saturday, August 26th. So we're probably not going to see Joe Burrow play. Joe Burrow's kind of a mobile quarterback. He's only mobile when he needs to be, right? He'd rather be that pocket passer, gunslinger, as we know him to be, but he can run when he needs to. So we're probably not going to see Joe Burrow play in that final preseason game. We probably may not even see our own first team defense play in that 3rd preseason game. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. So as Paul says, hey, can we just beat the Ravens Monday night, stop the preseason streak at 24? We're going to try. I feel like we actually have the team that might be able to do it. Like I said, it kind of goes back to, how much are they going to play the first string? I would love to see the first string, our first teamers, especially offense, play at least the first quarter. Like I said, if anything else, it gets us more comfortable with Sam Howell. It gets Sam Howell more comfortable with the offensive line, wide receivers, tight ends. It gets Sam Howell more comfortable, and the entire offense comfortable with each other. It gets more cohesion and communication with the offensive line. It's going to get everybody more comfortable with EB's playbook and what he expects. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. And next week, I would love to see him break the streak. I don't put a whole lot of stock in preseason games, but it kind of is what it is at this point. So, last but not least, one of the things that kind of jumps out to the end of the discussion here tonight is just training camp in general, right? So, each day is training camp. It's the next day of training camp. We're now getting pads on. We're now hitting each other, whatever, whatever. It's kind of like just Groundhog Day for the most part. However, one of the things that was arranged this year was today and tomorrow, closed to the public, is inter-team practices between the Washington Commanders and the Baltimore Ravens. Today, it was kind of interesting. They asked Ron Rivera what his expectations were going in. He said he had a phone conversation with John Harbaugh to kind of lay the groundwork for what they were going to do at practice, how they're going to run it, interposition drills, whatever, 7-on-7s, 11-on-11s, yada, yada, yada. One of the things I saw come out shortly after lunchtime, so it was hot off the press. It didn't take long. I didn't think it would get that involved. First bench clearing brawl that between the two teams. It's training camp. It's preseason. Is there a lot to brawl over? Probably not. But one of the things was it came down. The rookie cornerback Emmanuel Forbes made a pretty good play on the ball, broke up a pass. Ravens guy went to the ground. I guess didn't like it. Some words were exchanged. Next thing you know, they're pushing and shoving. A couple guys get into it. Defensive guys run onto the field. They break it up. A couple plays later, probably not more than, 5-10 minutes later. I don't know the concept. I don't know the storyline leading up to it. I only saw the resulting video on Twitter that showed a bunch of guys basically throwing haymakers. It looked like the baseball game the other week between the White Sox and the Cleveland. That all of a sudden you start seeing front punches getting thrown, guys run out on the field, teams clear the benches, coaches separating everybody, whistles being blown, and everybody going back to their respective sidelines for a little timeout. But one of the things that kind of makes it a benefit to having these practices is you get a fresh set of guys to go against. You're not going against the same guys every day in practice. You're going against somebody new energy, new techniques, new perspectives to just 1 or 2 days of training camp that can be very beneficial. So it's interesting that, the takes on, they interview players from both teams and say, hey, what do you think about the guys on the other team? And a lot of the Ravens players gave Sam Howell some props for how he conducted the huddle, how he conducted his team on the 11-on-11 drives that they were doing. So Rivera thought Howell did a lot of good things, did some good things, did some things well. Would like to see him release the ball a little bit quicker in some certain circumstances, probably from a heavy rush or that presence from the Ravens front four, maybe even some front seven. But overall, he had a pretty solid day. Terry McLaurin said he loved going against another set of DBs and safeties from another team. Loved the fact that it was a good measuring stick for him and the other wide receivers to kind of see where the offense is at right now with the new playbook from EB, how everything's meshing, how things are going, yada, yada, yada. One of the things that kind of came out was there were a couple holding penalties, a couple false starts. Offensive line was good when they needed to be, but still kind of put an average performance together. So it's definitely something that, needs to be kept an eye on. The offensive line kind of shined when they needed to, but didn't keep that up the entire practice. So, as London Fletcher noted, who's one of the team insiders, does pregame, postgame for the Commanders, says, we matched the intensity of the Ravens at the beginning, and in most cases out-physicaled them, and our offensive line played outstanding. They performed well. We just didn't necessarily carry that the entire inter-team practice. So it's definitely something to watch for. Excuse me. As we noted, opposing team members talk about, these Washington Commander players. Marlon Humphreys, who's no slouch of his own, Ravens prolific cornerback, said that Sam Howell looked really comfortable. It looked like he's starting to understand the offense. He's actually doing a pretty good job recognizing defenses and making his selections. It'll be interesting to see as we put it together each week, and ramp things up for the start of week one, how Sam Howell is going to progress. But coming from Marlon Humphreys, that's pretty good props for basically second year player, first full season rookie in Sam Howell. And that's kind of the things that we want to see, right? So it'll be interesting to see where we go from here. We're still moving guys around on the offensive line. Stromberg was working in at guard, even though he was drafted as a center out of Arkansas, which is kind of what we knew going into training camp, that he wasn't necessarily going to be playing center. By looking at the depth chart, he's probably going to be going into guard behind Cosme and maybe even over to left guard, depending on how that works out there. Paul is still probably penciled in at the left guard spot. And Sadiq Charles is back working with the ones, which is kind of interesting that he's been dealing with some injury as well as mental aptitude issues, so to speak. Not necessarily getting the playbook down, a couple penalties here and there. As we noted earlier with the fights, with the bickering and stuff like that, the emotions and the intensity is high at team practice with the Baltimore Ravens. The defensive line, the front four that we mentioned earlier, which we all know can be one of the most prolific in the NFL, can eat, and they made their presence known today as well against Baltimore's offense. As one of the things that we just talked about pretty recently was containing that mobile quarterback. So that was noted today as well between Lamar Jackson practicing with the ones as well as Josh Johnson. I think his name is the QB2 for the Baltimore Ravens. He's pretty mobile as well. So, how do we fix that, or how do we focus on that moving forward? As I said earlier, Manuel Forbes, the rookie out of Mississippi State, looked pretty good. Looked like the best corner on the field today for our defense, which is actually pretty good. Knowing that, back there with Cam Curl, Kendall Fuller, Ben St. Juste, who actually didn't practice today, our secondary can look pretty good. But overall, we held our own on both sides of the ball, so it gives us pretty good promise. So it'll be interesting to see how tomorrow goes, the second and last day of inter-team practice with the Baltimore Ravens. So looking ahead, next week's show, we'll probably dive into more of a recap since we have a preseason game on Monday night against the Baltimore Ravens. We'll look ahead also at Cincinnati to see what may or may not come. Yes, Tyler Huntley and Josh Johnson are the quarterback backups. I forgot about Huntley. I think he went to the Pro Bowl last year, but I remember Johnson because I saw him in some video clips today of the Ravens practice and didn't see any of Huntley. So maybe he didn't practice, or maybe he did, but it was a short time and just didn't make any of the highlights that I saw. We'll also take a look at some of the season prediction schedules as we move forward between next week and the week after. We'll break down the schedule a little bit more and our opponents, kind of see where we fit. Is 10 wins achievable this year? I'm not 100% sold on that. Unfortunately, the over-under with the Vegas odds puts us at like 6.5, 7. So hitting that over-under might be harder when we break it down and you see who we're playing and why. And, we'll kind of go from there. But before we leave, we're going to hit our sponsors real quick. As you all know, one of our first sponsors here is Dugout Mugs. Use the promo code OOTB Sports 20 at dugoutmugs.com for your discount. They make an awesome product. Jump on there, use the promo code, get you 20% off for your Dugout Mug, and enjoy a fine beverage while you're watching the game as we go in through the season. Next is Cult Monkey Coffee. I should say Monkey Cult Coffee, with new flavors, bourbon chocolate chip and toasted coconut rum. You can use the same promo code OOTB Sports at monkeycultcoffee.com for your discount there. They also donate about 10% of each sale to the National Pediatric Foundation, which is a phenomenal cause helping kids beat cancer. So if you need your apparel, need your coffee supplies, as well as coffee in general, jump over there to Monkey Cult Coffee and get your high fixed. Last but one more, we have Jason Fine at 1-800-HURT-123. Attorney Big Al with 3 locations in Philadelphia, Cherry Hill, New Jersey, Pittsburgh, PA. Jason Fine, attorney at law. That's 1-800-HURT-123 to help you out with all of your legal needs. As I said, next week's show might be a little different. I'm actually on the road for work. We're still going to have next week's episode. I'm just not sure how we're going to pull it off quite yet, but it will be here. So we'll have stuff to talk about, even if it's pre-recorded, for you guys to watch and kind of keep up to date with what's going on with the team for preseason, headline news, training camp news, position, signatures and cuts, and everything else as we kind of start talking about how to whittle down to the final 53-man roster and any injuries that take place. So we'll have a show next week, just not sure exactly how we're going to do that. So with that being said, we're going to be signing off tonight for the Commanders GridIron. Have a good week, have a good night, and take care of yourselves.